Hello there.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I think we're live. Yeah.
It seems we are.
I'm a senior programmer at the Chicago International Film Festival, and we're really excited to have with us the director of Spaceship Earth, Matt Wolf, and two of the subjects of the film, two biospherians, Mark Nelson and Linda Lay. So hopefully by now everyone has seen the movie. It's been streaming for a while. Maybe they've seen it more than once, and lots to dig into. And I know the film was a huge hit at Sundance, and now it's playing just about everywhere there's a screen. So it's very exciting. Let me just, before I bring in Mark and Linda, Matt, I just wanted to, thanks for coming. Thanks for making a film that has just become more and more resonant as the weeks bear on. For those of you out there who don't know, Matt made a film previously called Recorder, the Marion Stokes Project, which was really just like maybe last year, right? It came out?
Yeah, it was released this past fall.
Yeah, so you're cranking them out. This is and Spaceship Earth is your fourth documentary feature, is that right?
Yeah.
So what's interesting to me about these last two, about Recorder and Spaceship Earth, is in some way they're both stories of people who are end up inside a lot. Marion Stokes recorded how many years of TV footage?
Marion Stokes recorded 30 years of television, 24 hours a day on multiple networks.
Right. So, and then we have, of course, the biospherians who were shut in for 2 years. They're also both stories of kind of activists and impossible almost missions. And I'm wondering if these two things have any, any reason why you feel like you've tackled these two stories.
Well, I'm into cultural history, and Marion Stokes's collection really captured a pivotal moment in the transformation of media. And I'm also into stories about unusual visionaries, people who pursue unprecedented projects, and often those projects are not appreciated or recognized during that individual's lifetime. Fortunately, the biospherians and the people who conceived of Biosphere 2 are alive and still doing interesting work. But I'm interested in reappraisals and what you might call hidden histories. In the case of Marion, her story was not known, and my film kind of brought her to the fore, and it had a kind of enhanced relevance because her mission for taping the news was to protect the truth. And this was obviously decades before the idea of fake news took hold. And, I saw the story of Biosphere 2 as being very prescient in regards to climate change, and how the biospherians, Mark and Linda included, modified their behavior inside Biosphere 2 where they work together to modify their impact on this atmosphere. So I thought that was very prescient in terms of climate change. But of course, the film has taken on a kind of uncanny similarity to our collective experience of being quarantined that I could never have expected. But to me, they're both stories about visionaries that show the full complexity of people who pursue unprecedented projects, and both the unique opportunities that they create and also the challenges that they face.
Filmmakers kind of do that too.
Yeah. I'm not calling myself a visionary.
No,
though.
well, fair enough. Well, let me I'll now introduce our special guest. So Mark Nelson, Dr. Mark Nelson, is an ecologist and organic farmer, and the chairman and CEO of the Institute of Ecotechnics, still in functioning. And Linda Lee is a systems ecologist and a worm farmer. If someone has worm farming questions, I'm happy to take those. For you guys, what is this? I know you've been doing a lot of these Q&As, right? You were joking before about seeing each other again. Has the film brought the community back maybe together in a way? Have you consistently kept in touch over these years, or has there been a kind of reconnection?
I personally haven't spoken with the rest of the crew since the film has come out. So we did have a reunion about 1.5 years ago, which was magnificent because we kind of left on difficult notes, and some of us hadn't seen each other in about 25 years. So the coming back together at a reunion was just lovely. Everybody kind of dropped the bad feelings that they had, and we became happy. But I really haven't checked in with everybody else to find out what their impression of the film is. Have you, Mark?
No, I haven't actually. And 3 of our remaining biospherians, Roy Walford died about 15 years ago. They live in Indonesia, so I think Neon hasn't released the film worldwide, but I'm eager to hear what everyone thinks about the film. I'm sure everyone will be delighted because Matt and his producers did such an amazing job of telling a complex story. There's only so much you can do in 2 hours, but he certainly did. It's an epic tale. And it's a tale very appropriate for the current, for the present moment.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second. There was something, Matt, that you said about Marion's sort of quest for the truth or preserving the truth, and I think this question could actually go to sort of everyone, and that is, there was a reputation of the Biosphere 2 project and became a kind of negative reputation at a certain point. And I wonder if the film is, battling maybe that fake news aspect of it, getting at truths that were there that maybe were not told. And I wonder if Matt, if that was sort of part of your mission, and if Mark and Linda, you feel like that the full story maybe wasn't adequately told, and the film helps give that truth.
Well, I don't think fake news is a fair term to use in regards to the reporting on Biosphere 2. I think that the media simplified the project, and that the project had a lot of different levels and layers to it. It was difficult to communicate about to the media, and it was also a pilot run. A lot of the whole point was that things that weren't expected were going to happen, and it's difficult to communicate about that on the world stage. I don't think the media misrepresented or lied about the project. I think there were issues of communication and transparency with the media, which stoked skepticism. And then the media's ultimate antagonism of the management of Biosphere 2, as well as the Biospherians, it made the reputation of the project languish. So to me, the media is a character in the film. It's not the antagonist, but it was an important dimension towards the long-term perception of Biosphere 2.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think the media did kind of latch on to certain ideas that they wanted to latch on to. I know looking in the film when I was taking Phil Donahue through the biosphere, and he really pushed the issue of not opening the door for 100 years. Well, I really didn't believe we were going to open the door for 100 years, except for people coming in and out. And at that time, that was my own naivete. But we didn't have any data to support anything either way. So for me to have said that was probably a mistake, but who would guess that something like that would create such a media hubbub?
Right.
My short take on that is I think the film very accurately portrays the media as sensationalizing the project, simplifying it to the nth degree. And I'll say mea culpa, I was a director of the project, that, we had done 20 years of work with the Institute of Ecotechnics, very happily low profile, relevant to the regions and the fields that we were engaged in. And it was intended to be a very quiet R&D facility. Why would you put something that you wanted, the world to pay attention to in hot as hell for 6 months of the year, southern Arizona? But there was something about the biosphere when even the model was put into stories first in Europe and then picked up around the world that just captured the world's imagination. So, Linda, I guess you weren't in some of the project review committees I was in, but we would end every meeting with all of our top consultants being asked to give the 10 nightmare scenarios that kept them up at night. So certainly I had no expectation, or certainly, I mean, I hope that we could last the 2 years. We called it a shakedown mission. And you know, among the things that the media, you know, preferred not to tell people, it was designed as a 100-year experiment. And, you know, there was space applications, but it was by no means, we were not in the illusion that we were living in a Mars colony. It was a new kind of Earth and Earth biosphere laboratory. So, yeah, so, you know, the film accurately gives the yo-yo that we were subject to. And I kind of love it now because aside from lazy journalists who repeat those storylines from back then, it's now not in the currency of people aside from those who were old enough to have lived through Biosphere 2. So there's a whole new generation that I hope this film spurs some interest in.
I have another question, and we're also getting some questions from the audience. So I'll start to take those if other people want to ask questions. So the film itself was far less cynical than I expected. And you know, in reading the materials, and I watched the trailer, and I feel like, you know, you're kind of, it sounds like a story that's going to maybe make fun, right? Similar to the media. And I do think that there is a far more hopeful, idealistic look at the project. Not idealistic look, but sympathetic look at the project. And I guess I wondered, I guess I wondered about that, about staying away from maybe a cynical, you know, almost satirical look, which I think could very well be made. And Matt, were you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some filmmaker out there who would have tried to do some sort of takedown and to depict Mark and the Synergists as a cult, and to really dig into that and try to find evidence of it and to portray them in a sensationalized way. I mean, or to make a Wild Wild Country style miniseries that really heightened the kind of reality television drama aspect. My experience is I certainly asked Mark and Linda about sensational things, and they didn't have sensational things to say. That might be because that's not how you guys want to represent your work, because there was seriousness behind it. But it also might mean because it wasn't there and you were working all the time and doing farming and very busy, and that the pressure and stress you felt was real, but that it wasn't like a reality television show. And I didn't find the Synergia Ranch to be a cult. That wasn't my perception of it. So in some senses, yeah, I went into it not interested in doing a gotcha or a takedown. I wouldn't commit myself to spending that level of time and interest in something if I didn't have empathy or interest in it. But at the same time, in my kind of discovery, that wasn't really there in a significant sense. That's what was reported in the media in a sensationalized way, because I think this type of story really stokes the kind of curiosity that gets people to watch reality television. But this project had something else going on, and I found myself being inspired by the material. I actually didn't set out to make a quote-unquote inspirational film, but I found myself becoming inspired, and I think that's reflected in the filmmaking as well.
Matt had to go through a lot of screens of different people in order to be accepted to do this film. And over the past, I don't know, decade, I've been approached by 3 or 4 every year, different film groups that want to make a film about Biosphere 2. Matt's really the only one who I felt really comfortable with. So I knew he wasn't going to do something cynical. That's not something that he would set out to do. He just wanted to do the straightforward story, which was magnificent. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
If anyone was cynical, it was us about, oh, there's another group, want to make the Biosphere 2 documentary. So yeah, we put Matt and the producers through the ropes. We gave them homework. We tested out,
I
and
always do my homework. I always come back with answers. But no, I mean that's my job. That's my responsibility, is to not convince you, but to demonstrate that I'm not going to flatten your story and to make it superficial. I would not go to someone unless they truly are a villain of our times and try to convince them to participate in something in a meaningful way and then to completely tear them down. I just can't imagine doing that. And it's interesting. This is a bit of a digression, but I was talking to Scott McCauley, the writer and producer and publisher, and I was saying, what's a good example of a film in which the filmmaker is intimately involved with a protagonist who they take down? And we couldn't really think of a good example, and I wonder if other people can think of an example, because I struggle to imagine a circumstance in which I would ask someone for their trust and engage them in the filmmaking process and then completely take them down.
Tiger King?
What's that?
I said Tiger King.
Tiger King. Yeah.
So we do have some questions. A quick factual one, and it was I had a question about it too. So from Dennis Squibb, he asks, how sick did Mark and Linda get without the oxygen not being pumped in? How long did it take for the group to realize that they needed more oxygen? Can you clarify the timeline there?
Well, I think it was about 14 or 15 months into the experiment that we realized that that the oxygen was having an impact on our health. And for me, the way that manifested was I walked very, very slowly. I could barely walk up steps without stopping at every step to take a breath. And you can even hear it on one of my dream therapy sessions in the film, where I'm speaking and I have to, every 2 or 3 words, I stop to take a breath. So we found out that, of course, low oxygen can create brain damage, and we didn't want to take it down to that level, of course. So we decided we had a few options. It was either to pump in the oxygen, to ride it down and possibly die, which of course was not really an option, or to come out of the biosphere. None of us wanted to do that.
So what was the time period between like, oh wait, I'm starting to slur my speech and there's a problem, or was it like, oh, there's a problem with the oxygen levels, and then like a week later you started to like slur your speech?
It's a really interesting thing, because we had so many sensors, and we had, I think it's shown in the film, a just magnificent analytic laboratory that could analyze in parts per million, parts per billion, everything in our air and water. And we didn't learn about the oxygen, I think, until 4 or 5 months, after the beginning of the closure, because we had a faulty sensor. And by that time, this was like spring of our, we'd been in there for about 6 months. The oxygen had dropped about 2%. And it was just startling, because that wasn't one of the scenarios that we, were worried about to begin with. So I think the crew, everyone in there, we really wanted to maximize the research that that would be yielded from our living in there for 2 years. So we agreed. I mean, we did ride the oxygen down. Linda and a number of the other crew people started to have sleep apnea, and we we're able to concentrate oxygen in the atmosphere in our analytic lab, and we ran tubes of oxygen to a few of the crew. And then finally, the straw, I guess, was when Roy Walford realized that he couldn't add up a series of numbers on a pad. And he checked with his medical consultants outside, and they said, now's the time. It was actually 16 months after the beginning. But what was lovely about the oxygen was that, one, it was unexpected. So it really underlined, which is why we built Biosphere 2, how little we know about how even a mini biosphere will operate. What unexpected things will happen. And also, Roy was over the moon, and our biomedical consultants, because ordinarily you only have depleted oxygen when you literally climb a mountain. So we were climbing a mountain at the slowest mountaineering pace ever. And finally, we were something close to 15,000 feet of altitude, but Biosphere 2 had not moved. We were at 3,900 feet, there in the foothills of the mountains in southern Arizona. So a great opportunity to distinguish two parts of the equation. Does high altitude or the depleted oxygen trigger the human physiological response?
That kind of anticipates a question I guess I was asked is when you started to have some of the problems that you had, the oxygen, food supply, animals. My question was like, was there a sense of, and this is maybe a personal question for you, for the two of you, were you thinking we should go, or and one gets a sense from the film and from what you're saying, Marcus, we can use all of this as science.
I never felt we should go, and I'm not sure anybody else did. The things that we could have done, and we did do some of them, were to bring in a bag of 100 pounds of beans to allay the hunger and the caloric deficit that we were making by working harder than the amount of calories we were putting into our body. So that was one thing. We could bring things in instead of taking ourselves out of the equation. And the same with the oxygen. So I never wanted to leave the biosphere ever for any reason. But adding the oxygen was a big decision.
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of dispute in the crew as part of the tension. I think the other part of it, the expedition literature is replete with what they call explorers' cholera, which is people basically suffering from cabin fever, from factionalism, you name it. There was all of that going on. But, what was really striking, Roy Walford, I think, is quoted somewhere as saying, sometimes I really detested some of the other crew, but God damn it, we were a great team. And I think part of that was that each and every one of us had worked like our butts off to become biospherians. We really believed in the project. And this to me is the flip side of the group dynamics in the quarantine, is that we all fell in love with Biosphere 2, and we really understood at a very profound level that our health was equal to that of Biosphere 2. It was our lifeboat. Yeah. So never did anybody, sabotage other people's research, or even more unthinkable, harm the biosphere.
And the real challenge now is to get everyone on Earth to feel that way about Earth, Biosphere 1, to fall in love with Biosphere 2 and realize that the health of Biosphere 1, or rather Biosphere 1, the health of the Earth equals the health of the people.
Mark, I forgot to mention your book, the second edition, Life Under Glass, which obviously tells some of the stories of the Biosphere 2. Is there information in that book that is not in the film?
Oh, the film is magnificent, but Biosphere 2, has so many levels of interest. I've written several books. Linda did a PhD and writes about biosphere. All of the biosphereans write about it. I'll take this occasion to show the beautiful cover. Life Under Glass, second edition. This is the only book that was published and written by 3 of the biosphereans, 3 of the crew before we left Biosphere 2. And what's really lovely about the new edition is that we get a chance to look back and reflect on the lessons that we learned there, the relevance to our contemporary situation. There's a chapter with research highlights. And though it's true, as the film points out, that a lot of the data, has gone missing, there's a lot of data and scientific literature and personal accounts. And I hope that the film really triggers an interest in Biosphere 2. And it's not just because Linda and I and the rest of our crew were inside and it's a magnificent project. I think we were 50 years ahead of our time, and there are a lot of lessons from our experience living with a mini biosphere that are crucial. We are facing a a 5-alarm fire on Biosphere 1.
Right.
And I echo Linda, you need to start by first getting out of illusion. The environment, the biosphere is not outside of you. You are metabolically connected to it. And, we didn't quite get to the end of the oxygen story, but I think Linda and I and 6 other people will never take a breath of air for granted, because when you suddenly realize how vital oxygen, which the biosphere produces, is for our well-being. So there's a lot of material out there, and I hope people's interest and curiosity get triggered by this film.
Yeah, I think when our own quarantine isolation hopefully comes to an end, and when I suspect similar things will happen with people out in fresh air, right? So there's another question that is more specific to Mark and Linda, and then I want to bring Matt back into the discussion. So just a quick fact question. What is the university owner doing with the biosphere now? Do they conduct experiments there? Are there sleepovers?
Linda, do you want to go?
So I can begin on it anyway. They have a lot of outreach and a lot of classes that come there, and they don't stay overnight inside the biosphere, but there is housing outside of the biosphere where people stay, and they can stay there for a few days. And I have the pleasure of being able to speak to those classes. Maybe a few times a year, I go in and talk about what it was like to build the biosphere and to live inside. I only live about 10 miles away, so it's a real easy thing for me to do. And there is a lot of research being done inside the biosphere, a lot of smaller projects that I don't know about, but I know there's a lot of work being done on the bleaching of corals and what can be done on Earth to help the coral reefs along from the drastic decline that they've seen due to our actions. And so some of that work is happening inside Biosphere 2 in the coral reef, which once was a beautiful, vibrant coral reef. But of course, the corals started bleaching and the reef started dying. There's a very enormous experiment being done there on kind of the way water flows through systems and the geology and what happens with soils as water falls on it. And it's a huge experiment that's taking place inside of where we used to have our farm. So when I go back, it's no longer a farm, which kind of breaks my heart. But anyway, and it is a closed system experiment. So they have sealed off 3 different chambers to compare different scenarios.
So there was a question earlier from an audience member, and there's a question I wanted to ask too about the appearance of Steve Bannon in this story. Obviously Steve Bannon now has a whole lot of associations with Donald Trump and the alt-right. So a question really for Matt is, there is this, kind of explosive figure tied to this project, but, he's a very minor character and comes in, at the end. And I was curious about how you dealt with that revelation in the film.
Yeah, I mean, it was like a metaphor handed over on a platter to me. I didn't live through it, but here comes the contemporary political villain of our times taking over this wonderful project. But it's the takeover, as Mark had said to me long ago. The takeover of Biosphere 2 is no different than the takeover of Biosphere 1, where these political and economic forces destroy innovative projects so that capitalism can continue to pillage our natural resources and destroy our future on the planet. That was a nice one. Happy note. And so, it was a way to throw the story into the present and to show the present tense stakes of not only the possibilities of idealism and human achievement through collaboration, but the limits of them and the forces that thwart visionary activities and people. So Steve Bannon was a pretty effective foil or metaphor to deal with those ideas. And the real question is, how do how do you wrap up a story that ends so abruptly? And that was a big creative challenge to figure out how to end it. And Linda and Mark could attest. I had to go back and film with them more after the editing process to deepen that reflection and to really make the film be about groups of people and how those relationships can last regardless of those relationships can last and those ideals can last regardless of any external perceptions of success or failure.
So there was another question from the audience. Matt, and I'm going to slightly rephrase it actually. Were there any stories that you had heard of the biosphere and their experiences that you wanted to include in the film, but like there wasn't footage of, or like you just couldn't get any, or you couldn't get that nugget of information, whether it was archival footage that disappeared, or a story that you heard later,
The thing that's so crazy about this story is that there's archival footage for every single aspect of what happened, and that's remarkable. I mean, you see a sequence in the film in which the ecologist Tony Burgess had gabbed too much and had to confront the biospherians about gossiping, and they were all very angry at him. And when I saw that footage, I was like, how on earth does this footage exist? This is a very dramatic point in the story. How is it possible that this video conference was recorded and then I have access to it? So that was remarkable. But one thing that I've thought of over the days is there was a Biospherian reunion the day I was filming with Mark and Linda. And I wish I could have been there. I wish I could have been there. And that's one thing that I couldn't film that I would have been really curious about. But in general, in terms of archival footage, it was extraordinary how much there was.
How much? How much did you did you catalog?
We had 600 hours of footage and 2,000 photographs, which sounds insane, but is a manageable amount of material given the types of films I make. But what was exceptional was the quality of the footage. Marie Harding, one of the people who is a colleague of Mark's since the early days in the 60s, she's a wonderful cinematographer. She often filmed things from multiple angles. It was as if she was making a movie that hadn't been made and a story that hadn't been told. And then Dr. Roy Walford, the Biospherian, filmed beautiful stuff inside Biosphere 2 that without his keen observation and eye, nobody would understand what life inside was really like. So it was a real gift to have access to not just a lot of material, but material that was really thoughtfully and beautifully made.
Question for Linda and Mark. What was it like to adapt to life after the Biosphere experiment? And maybe a lesson for us all.
To me, it was really difficult to do things where there were a lot of choices, like go into a grocery store. I just was awed by the amount of choices that there were in a grocery store. I was so used to just growing my own stuff and having what we had. Driving the car was almost unbearable because of the speed. I was not used to going fast anywhere. I had keys and money, and I didn't have to lock anything in the biosphere. I didn't have to buy anything inside the biosphere. But all of a sudden, I had to deal with keys and money and forms and all this stuff. And I still don't like all that stuff. So that was it. It was kind of a shock. I'm not sure I'm still over it.
One of the really interesting things about, and we called it re-entry. And, amazingly, in the years before the internet, sounds like we have children on the loose, maybe, or cats. It was something close to 1 billion people watched and, saw that re-entry around the planet. And for us, stepping through that door and having your first breaths of outside air was just remarkable. And there's a videotape. I think, Matt, you only used that little clip of me during we all had fairly emotional things to say, and mine was about how living in a small world really profoundly changes you. But there's a moment when I'm looking out and I can just get back to that point, because among the pleasures of Biosphere 2 we had some drawbacks. It was a terrible place for looking at stars, and you really couldn't see the horizon because it was kind of washed out by looking through glass. And I remember, first off, feeling the emotional energy of the several thousand people who came out to welcome us back. And I was just mesmerized by looking at the Earth's horizon, from a beautiful place in southern Arizona. So for about 6 months, I felt much more, and I was working on the research and the improvements and training of the second crew. It was really interesting. My center of gravity was still in BIOSPHERE 2. I felt more, my organism was really comfortable there, and it took a lot of getting used to get acclimatized to life outside. And the last point, like Linda was saying, when I look back on it, we had such a clean environment, and everything that we did in BIOSPHERE 2 had a consequence, and was part of us taking care and loving and managing our biosphere and being responsible biospherians. Everything made sense. And now we're back in a world where a lot of what we have to do makes no sense at all.
The corollary question, and I know you've been asked this before. I mean, you talk about that world making sense in that bubble. And we're all in our bubbles now. And I guess I wonder, what are the lessons learned about being in a bubble that you might impart to people who are all quarantined? Linda, you're comfortable with it, all right?
I don't feel like I'm in a bubble. I live in kind of a rural place, so I'm out and about all the time. So it's really that it's not a good one for me to answer, comparing it to what I have now. But I think one of the things that we learn from being with a small group of people is to, as much as you can, have special days or special events. We had, at least once a month, we had a big feast. And so having something like that at least once a month, write something and read to each other what you wrote about what your feelings are being confined, that would make a difference. We did that as well inside of the biosphere. So there are a few things that helped us, but I never felt cabin fever at all inside the biosphere. I never felt closed in. I never felt wanting for anything except for walking for a long distance in one direction.
I think that some of the difficult days is when there was a snowstorm outside, and I think we all felt this irresistible urge. We were not locked in. We were volunteers, and we could leave at any moment. But as Linda said, that was unthinkable. We were having so much fun, even during the difficult times, learning so much, and we're all aware we're doing something that no other group of people have done. But the urge to go through that airlock and roll in the snow is really great. One of the things I'm really proud about is, unlike the Right Stuff, and I love that, Matt, I wasn't actually in that production, The Wrong Stuff, the wonderful theater production, imagining everything that could go wrong that the Biospherean candidates put on, is we were encouraged to express emotionally, artistically, musically, however you wanted to do it. What was it like? It's the only place that I've written poetry for 2 years. It may not be the greatest poetry, but I wrote poems to our pigs and our goats and to our sweet potatoes and our white potatoes. And
I should have had you read your poems, and I put them over shots of pigs.
I don't know. I think we would have gotten more negative reviews if you weren't.
Yeah.
We really had fun doing that, and then we had some what we called inter-biospheric arts festivals, where we linked up with artists and musicians and poets, both on site and around the country through the communications. So I think what I'd say to people is, use this shock time as a reflection point to really, dig deep and be creative. And if I had one thing to go back and do in Biosphere 2, it was be kind to your friends. Be as kind as you can. Try to be understanding. And, in some sense, 2 years in Biosphere 2 was a prolonged group therapy encounter group for me. And I got a lot of value out of it. I think I worked out a lot of personality hang-ups. And because rumors were rife that we were going nuts, the head of the psychiatry department at the University of Arizona Medical School, digitally interviewed all of us, and we took the standard tests, and we may have felt like we were going nuts, but in fact we were, filling the explorer adventurer profile. And interestingly enough, the women and the men, almost identical profiles and very similar to that of the NASA astronauts.
So, Mark, your question, your answer sort of keys into one of the questions here that I wanted to get to, and I'm going to spin it to Matt as well. From Christy Lemaster, she asked this. She says, "This movie made me think a lot about collectivity," which I think you're speaking to, and alternative family structure. So the question I wanted to turn to Matt to is was that kind of a driving force for you in terms of, looking at a functioning collective, right? Not a cult, but a positive collective. And then for Mark and Linda, did you have any changed perspectives on interpersonal relationships by being so closely connected to this collective?
Hi, Christy. Good to hear from you. I hope you're doing well. That was one of my primary interests in making the film, is ideas of alternative family and community and small groups, just as a different model of people achieving goals, but also finding mutual support and aid, and creating long-term relationships that are functional outside of the conventional family structure. That interests me. You could call it intentional community or collaboration, but those are things that I hold to be important in my life that I saw in this story.
I got pretty interested in why people are drawn to each other, and I was drawn to this project because it was a group of people that were passionate about a goal that I was also passionate about. So it was a magnetic experience for me to come and start working in the group. But since the BIOSPHERE, I've been pretty interested in the way groups evolve and the way they mature. And I'm working with a team on a community learning garden in Oracle, and I'm watching that evolution happen. And I'd never really thought about that before, about how groups evolve and how they change, and that maturation where you really form really a synergetic group. It's really a beautiful thing to behold.
Yeah, for my part, I was 22 years old, a New York City kid. I had, finished my Ivy League degree, and, my family fully expected me to become upwardly mobile. They could barely read, and, they were Russian and Polish Jewish immigrants from the old country, to become a doctor or a lawyer. And I absolutely thought that would be so boring. So I think that the film does capture, I plead guilty to idealism, and I plead guilty for wanting more than our society tends to offer people. So when I came to Synagogue Ranch through a series of good karma and coincidences, and they told me, we do three things. We don't just do one thing. We do theater of all possibilities, so you can learn to use your body and your emotions, and do classic plays and do improvisational plays. We will work on ecological upgrade. That's the Institute of Ecotechnics, and we launch projects around the world. And we want to be entrepreneurial. So I know the word capitalist was thrown around in the film, and I think we kind of use that terminology as a little bit of a shield. Oh yeah, we're capitalists just like everyone else. No, not really. What we mean by running an enterprise is doing something from beginning to end, and where the top line increase, the benefit to our ecosystem, diversity, biomass, is equally important to the bottom line. And this was the program, and it brought us around the world, and eventually to our ultimate test case, Biosphere 2.
Wasn't it Ed Bass who started throwing around the word ecopreneur?
Mhm.
Yeah, ecopreneur.
Yeah. What a great word.
Philecology to complement philanthropy.
Yeah.
So we have two more questions I'm going to throw one at Mark and one at Linda because they're kind of aimed at you guys. Mark, can you talk a little bit about any previous projects that that you created that are still going on?
I could, and I'll direct people to ecotechnics.edu where they can get links to the projects. So after a decade at Synergia Ranch, which still is going strong, I'm here in my germ pod with about 12 people, getting our organic vegetable operation and fruit orchard ready for the season. There are other enterprises here, including a book publishing enterprise. We have the October Gallery in London, which has now become a digital platform, but it's an amazing gallery which features cutting-edge artists from around the world. And the other two that I'll mention is Birdwood Downs, where I spent a couple decades of my life in the Australian outback, modestly working on the pasture regeneration of 5,000 acres that were so degraded that it made the devastation at Synergia Ranch look tranquil. The Heraclitus is in Spain being rebuilt. We hope for another few decades of operation. And another project very dear to my heart is Las Casas de la Selva in Puerto Rico. We're on about 900 acres. We're, boldly going where people usually just talk about it. Can we do sustainable forestry in a really good and ecologically sound way in a secondary rainforest?
Great. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
Linda, I'm going to give you the last question here, and then I think we're running out of time. So the question, I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, but was there anything coming out of Biosphere 2 that changed your sort of day-to-day life that maybe we can all consider when thinking about sustainability and the environment?
Yeah. I think the one thing that is the most important, and all my friends would see, or anybody, even strangers would see, is I'm very serious about my exchange of breath with plants. So if I were to see you step on a plant, I would be furious because you're destroying some of the oxygen producers in our world. That's a big one for me. And a little anecdote about that is when I came out of the biosphere, I was in my dentist's office. This is a couple months after I was out of the biosphere. And I was sitting there waiting for my dentist, being scared out of my mind because I never know what's going to happen in a dentist's office. And I looked around and I panicked because there were no plants. And I just blurted out, "Where does your oxygen come from?" And so that was something that will always be with me, is thinking about that exchange of breath in our world and how important it is that we have plants that consume the CO2 and produce the oxygen. So I'll say that everybody should fall in love with a plant. Mark would say everybody should fall in love with the biosphere. I would say just find one plant or plant one plant and start caring just for that one plant. And that's going to lead you really a very great distance.
I think we will leave it at that. Let's care for those plants. Matt, I don't see any plants. Where are your plants?
They're in the other room.
Okay,
Linda already got on my case about it. There's no light in here.
Okay. Thank you, Matt, for making Spaceship Earth.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Linda, good luck with all your work. It's great. And I need some worm help, Linda. Thank you.
Great being with you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.